Good morning, Senator Newman. Your first bill is Senate File 3901 relating to the Real ID. Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I notice we have Clorox disinfecting wipes up here. I think that's left over from this morning's coronavirus hearing that we had. First of all, on this particular Senate file, I do have an amendment, which is the A3 amendment, and I believe, Mr. Chairman, that would be an author's amendment.
Senator Newman moves the A3 amendment. I believe it's all in our packet. Any questions on the A3 amendment? If not, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Senator Newman, to your bill.
Then, Mr. Chairman, I do have a small oral amendment to offer to the A3 that we have just adopted, and I believe you have it in your packets, do you not?
Senator Newman, we're checking. 1 second.
Yeah. Where do we see that?
I need a few more minutes on that because they need a definitive date in the revisor's office, and we need to work on it a little bit. So can you hold off on it? I'll work on it.
Oh, sure.
Do it in a few minutes.
Because I was told by DPS this is what they wanted, but you're saying that is not the correct language.
It needs a little bit more than that. So
Okay.
give me a few minutes and we'll do it.
Okay.
Senator
Mr.
Newman.
Chairman, I've just been waived off on my oral amendment, so
Okay.
we will have the A3 as adopted at this point.
Okay. To your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is a bill that involves the Real ID. Keep in mind, members, that Real ID, in order to get on airplanes, military installations, et cetera, without a passport, you will need on October 1st. Last month, we had a legislative oversight committee hearing for the MNLARS Vitris system, and I will have Senator Dibble help me with if I leave something out, but some of the concerns that were brought up by Department of Public Safety is a backlog that they anticipate is going to occur if folks don't begin applying for their Real IDs now or very soon. As I recall, their anticipated backlog was about July 1st if we don't do anything. And what that means is when folks want to get on an airplane on October 1st and they have waited until, say, September to go on their trip in October or November, they're not going to be able to do it. So the suggestion is number one, in order to alleviate that backlog, all of us get on our social media and talk to our constituents about the fact that if you want a Real ID, you should be applying for it now. And otherwise, it is likely you will be caught up in a system and be very disappointed when you are unable to get on that airplane in October or November. The other thing that was suggested was that we take the required documents to prove residency and maybe ease them back a bit from what Minnesota law was currently requiring. And that is the purpose of the bill before you, is to ease those requirements. And what we're trying to do then with this bill is to take the advice from the Department of Public Safety and hopefully maybe make their job a little bit better and also help our constituents when they go to get that Real ID. So with that in mind, Representative Hornstein in the House and myself in the Senate decided we would be the chief authors of this bill. And we wanted to do that in collaboration in an effort that we would be able to move the bill forward pretty quickly I am frankly hoping that this will be on the governor's desk this month. So that takes a little bit of cooperation between the two bodies, and that's what Chair Hornstein and myself are trying to do. I hope, Senator Dibble, I have accurately relayed what occurred in that meeting for our various members. But just as an example of what is in the bill, in terms of easing the documentation, currently, and these are just examples, currently on a utility bill for purposes of proving residency, you cannot have two unrelated names on a utility bill. And frankly, there are a lot of folks who, married or not, are responsible for a utility bill but have different last names. And that's a document that, for instance, under this bill is eased. You would be able to use that. Another one is that a requirement that the employer's pay stub has to have the employer's phone number on it. And I don't know why that is necessary for purposes of proving ID, so this bill removes that requirement. And there's a number of things like that in the bill that you could look at. So that is a very short version of what the bill is about. I would ask that Ms. Stengel walk you through the bill, and then we'll try and answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Senator Newman. Lexi? Ms. Stengel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Section 1 of the bill was deleted by the author's amendment. Section 2 provides some changes, as Senator Newman talked about, what sort of documents, changes to the documents to show residency. So what the A3 amendment does is make a few changes to that, including when you use a high school or college transcript, you don't also have to show your ID card. It strikes a reference to a tax statement because that isn't a document that makes sense. And then on lines 111 through 118 of the amendment, it adds some additional documents, including a cell phone bill, a hunting or fishing license, and then for applicants under the age of 18, one of their documents can be something that their parent or guardian provides. And then finally, the effective date is 4 weeks after, and we're working on an oral amendment to change that to be 4 weeks after or sooner, and I'll have that for you soon, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to affirm that Senator Newman provided an accurate representation of the problems that we're attempting to solve that we identified in the task force, with the goal, of course, of easing the ability for folks to obtain real ID with as little aggravation as possible. Hopefully also to speed up the process. We already know that there are already many hours-long wait times at some of these offices, whether they're state-sponsored offices or deputy registrars. I just got some emails as well as texts from good friends who are frustrated with waiting many hours for their ID at the DR office off of Highway 100 at the AAA in St. Louis Park, and they were sympathetic to those who had actually gotten a number and in line at 4 o'clock, and after waiting an hour or more were told that they weren't going to be helped. So I don't know how much of this will speed up those lines, but that's certainly something we're very aware of. I will also just affirm Senator Newman's desire that we do our best to alert folks, just, if they want a real ID for purposes of flying commercial aircraft or, the other purposes for which real ID is needed, they should start now, or because these backups and delays at these offices, if we don't provide additional staffing and personnel to the DVS, which I hope we do, and maybe Senator Newman, you can address that. I'm sure the governor has probably spoken with you about that, or the agency has. There as we get into the summertime, it's going to be even worse. The other thing I just want to say for the record is that we need to be encouraging our constituents to do the pre-application online before they get to the office. That gets the ball rolling. It speeds it up for them. It also lets them know exactly what they need to bring in terms of paper records to the office so they don't get there and are short a document or two or don't have something in order, and then they get sent away, and then they're really frustrated. Those are fun calls to get in our offices. So, so encourage folks to get their real ID, start the process now, and to start the application process online. Really important for us out of our offices with the megaphones that we have to do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Dibble. Senator Howe.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Senator Newman, correct. Go ahead.
Senator Dibble's absolutely correct and I forgot to mention that, regarding the pre-application online. If folks would do that, I think that they would find that it works pretty well and would really save them a lot of time. So thank you, Senator Dibble, for bringing that up.
Thank you. Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I see DPS here in the audience. But I guess my question is, now that we deleted Section 1 to try and help speed up this process and actually let more folks be able to process these IDs, the concern I have is, what does DPS have in place to make sure that some of this stuff couldn't be pilfered or absconded with, and we have some fake real IDs out there with the actual documents? I mean, now that we're not going to do background checks for the people handling this, what safeguards are in place to make sure that some of that stuff isn't going out the door?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Newman.
I have been in contact with DPS about this. To that specific question, perhaps DPS could come forward and visit with
Mr. Chair.
Senator Howe.
Senator Dibble.
As he comes forward, I just want to point out that just because Section 1 is deleted doesn't mean the language about investigating criminal history, et cetera, is deleted. That just means that the change is deleted, which is the language on line 1.14. Current law, as it is, stands. So we're not repealing subdivision 1. We're just not amending it as called for in 1.14, which just says real ID compliant driver's license, real ID compliant identification cards. I mean, I think it's fine to hear what we do, but I just don't want the public or our members to be confused that we're repealing that. It just means that current law stands.
Assistant Commissioner, you want to address the issues, and please state your name for the record, please.
Good morning, Chair. Timothy Lino, Assistant Commissioner, Department of Public Safety. Good morning, Senators. Senator Howe, to your question. It has always been a requirement for real approved credentials that those that handle those have that criminal background check. That hasn't changed with what's being introduced here. Lacking that background check, you can continue to work on non-real credentials. So a non-real identification card or a non-real driver's license can be done by those that have not had a background check completed yet. Sometimes that's a benefit because it allows those employees to start on non-real credentials while the background check is being done so that we don't lose production time. And as they become competent enough that we trust that they move to that next level, the background check would have been done at that point, and they're allowed to do those credentials. We are exceptionally sensitive to the privacy and to the integrity of the data that's being provided us.
Thank you. Senator Senjum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Newman, would you take the bill and look at lines 211 and 213 with me? And my question is, and I don't know if bank, the word bank is a generic term for financial institutions, but and so I'm kind of wondering whether or not many people are married, if you will, to their credit union in terms of that kind of a financial institution that they relate to. And so my question is bank a generic term for a financial institution that covers perhaps all state or federal regulatory financial institutions, or should we insert credit union and maybe even more in that line?
Senator Newman.
Interesting question. I hadn't thought of. The subparagraph B is one that came into being after some discussion between staff and myself. Perhaps, there is a United States bank, there's also state banks, there's credit unions.
Yeah.
I would say that's a pretty good point.
And
that I
Mr.
had
Chair and Senator Newman, it perhaps isn't something to fix today, but, maybe it's some more thoughts on that,
Senator
unless this is the last stop.
Senator Senjum, I'm not too sure how to respond, but how about if we do this? Let me explore it a little bit. Unless someone with banking experience on the committee could help me with this, I guess I'd ask for a little bit more time, and perhaps we could offer some request to Representative Hornstein when he looks at this, and maybe he could fix that over in the House.
Sure.
I'm just not too
No,
sure.
and
how
I
to
just draw it
respond.
to your attention, Mr. Senator Newman.
Senator Senjum, Senator Newman, we've just been informed that the bill does need to go to finance, which we did not anticipate. We've been informed it does need to go to finance, so I would recommend we do that before finance and clean that up in the finance committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure, we do have an oral amendment coming. If adopted, will that still require the bill to go to finance, or can it go to the floor? Ms. Boyd is nodding her head.
I'm seeing some
It's
head
going to-
nods, yes, so
It's
I
going to
believe it's
fin-
going to finance. Better than judiciary, so. Any other questions? I just want to make one comment. So I did go get my real ID about 3 weeks ago and got all my documents ready. I do have a passport, so I didn't need it. I just wanted to go through for exercising purposes. It took me about 8 minutes. I had all my documentation ready. It went very smoothly, but I want to make sure that all our members and people put out that, again, if it does take longer in our things, that deputy registers are not at fault. This is things that we need to get done. I know the deputy registers sometimes get a lot of heat in their offices, but this is a requirement, federal and state, so please give patience with your deputy registers, but they did a great job of mine. I was in and out in about 8 minutes. So, any other comments? Senator Newman, closing comments.
The only closing comment I would make, I've been visiting with the Assistant Commissioner here about the application rate for Real ID, and maybe the number to stick in your head is right now there's approximately 14% of our population is Real ID compliant, which is a very small number of people. And if the folks want to get a Real ID, they got to get cooking and get that application in now. With that, I would move that.
Oops, Senator Newman, we actually need an oral amendment that we're going to, Lexi has ready, so I'll have Ms. Stengel report the oral amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Looking at the bill itself, on page 3, line 22, delete everything after the word effective and insert no later than 4 weeks following final enactment, the Commissioner of Public Safety must notify the reviser of statutes of the date the changes required by Section 2 are implemented. The date provided by the Commissioner is the effective date of this section.
Any questions on the oral amendment? Repeat it one more time, please, Ms. Stengel.
Thank you. So, page 3, line 22, delete everything after effective, and I'll read the whole sentence as it would appear. It says, this section is effective no later than 4 weeks following final enactment, period. The Commissioner of Public Safety must notify the reviser of statutes of the date the changes required by Section 2 are implemented. The date provided by the Commissioner is the effective date of this section. So in other words, it will be effective no longer than 4 weeks after after enactment. The reviser of statutes office needs a specific date, so somebody has to tell them what that date's going to be, so the Commissioner will fulfill that function.
Senator Dibble.
But if I could ask a question, but in no case would that be longer than 4 weeks out?
Ms. Stengel.
Correct, Mr. Chair. The first part is effective no later than 4 weeks.
Great. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chair, I'll just have a quick question for Senator Newman. I didn't want to
Senator
step on
Dibble.
his last word, but
Go ahead.
after we vote on this.
After we vote on this?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All those in favor of the oral amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Senator Dibble.
I kind of glossed over a question I had, and we don't need to discuss it now because we need to get on to the next bill, but I would appreciate the opportunity to understand better from the agency and how we intend to respond, whether we anticipate a surge, as more people become aware that they need to renew their license in order to get a real ID for purposes of commercial aviation travel. And, I'm hearing, I know we haven't seen the supplemental from the governor, that they're thinking they might have a request for some temporary increase in staffing to help us through that bubble. And so I would appreciate an opportunity at some future point in time to better understand that better and how the legislature might respond. Mr. Chair.
Senator Newman.
Mr. Chairman, we do have at the testifying table the Assistant Commissioner probably in as good a position as anybody to respond to Senator Dibble's concerns. Maybe we should just do it right now.
Assistant Commissioner, go ahead.
Sure. Senator. DVS continues to work on crunching numbers. We know that every 4 years in a national election, that causes a spike with people renewing their credentials so that they can update their address. We certainly know that in the summer, inherently, that's a higher renewal period if your driver's license is expiring. And we're also tracking the adoption rate. We know things such as if 37% of Minnesotans have passports, that those that have a passport, I think 80% right now are renewing with a real credential, even though they don't necessarily need to. So those numbers were even going back and forth as late as 9 o'clock last night as we tried to predict, based on some of those factors, where we might be. But I want to be clear, what you're doing here right now, this will have a dramatic impact on what's happening in the lobby of deputy registrars throughout the state of Minnesota. So when we see people line up, that's a frustration. What becomes even more frustrating is if they get to that counter and they find out that the utility bill that they brought or the other documentation they brought isn't going to work. This will clean up that. So it may speed the line a little bit, but it will certainly help to eliminate the second, third, or fourth time back that unfortunately is becoming more common at times.
Thank you. Senator Newman, would you like to closing statements?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we've covered it, and I do hope that this will alleviate the line and help alleviate some of the frustration on the part of our constituents. I also hope that carries over to DPS, and because I believe that there is a glut of applications coming, and I think DPS staff is going to be frustrated, and I think our constituents are going to be frustrated. And so maybe if we can get this to the governor and have him sign it, it will, to some degree, help. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would move that Senate File 3901 as amended be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Finance Committee.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Senator Newman. Thank you, Assistant Commissioner. Next bill up we have is Senate File 3571, Senator Newman, voter ID.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go through some very basics of the bill, but I do have an amendment that I'm going to want to offer, but I think I will wait to offer it until I have had a chance to explain the bill a little bit, and then I'm going to be asking Ms. Stengel to also walk through the bill and the amendment, particularly from a standpoint of the areas that the Transportation Committee has jurisdiction of when considering the bill. So first of all, I would ask that the members keep in mind that we have 4 basic areas where this committee has jurisdiction of this particular bill. The first area of jurisdiction is that, or involves voter ID cards that are created under this bill and are under the authority of the Department of Public Safety, with DPS and driver's license agents being responsible for taking applications, processing and issuing a voter ID card. The second area of jurisdiction involves DPS provides training to the driver's license agents with respect to the voter ID bill. The third area is programming changes that will be required to the driver's license system to handle the voter ID cards. And the fourth area of jurisdiction for the Transportation Committee are the implications to the DPS budget and the budget for driver's license agents. Before I have Ms. Stengel go through the sections of the bill in a little more detail, I do want to just touch on the underlying processes of the bill. And the very beginning, or the genesis of the bill, is the Crawford versus Marion County United States Supreme Court case that was decided by the United States Supreme Court in 2008. And that particular case is the legal basis for the drafting of this Senate File 3571. And to try and help you understand and guide you through the bill itself, I'll very briefly outline the holding of the United States Supreme Court in the Crawford case. The first thing that Crawford held is that a state has legitimate interests to prevent, detect, and deter voter fraud. The Crawford case held that the state has legitimate interests to improve and modernize their election procedures, and states have a legitimate interest in safeguarding voter confidence. Number two, the Crawford case held specifically that federal law authorizes states to use photo identification when involved in voting. Next, the Crawford case recognized that photo ID does impose a burden on the right to vote. But by providing for provisional balloting and free voter ID cards, that burden is mitigated. Finally, the Crawford case recognized specific classes of voters, where it said that there is a somewhat heavier burden on the elderly, those born out of the state, those with economic or personal limitations. However, the court held that burden is mitigated when a voter is unable to obtain the documents necessary in order to get the voter ID card, that they are able to execute an affidavit affirming that they have tried and have been unable to obtain a voter ID card, and in those cases, their ballot is in fact counted. In drafting Senate File 3571, I've tried very hard to follow the ground rules as outlined by the Crawford case, and I believe those ground rules are essentially protect the valid state interests in the integrity of our election process, while at the same time minimizing the burden on those who are required to obtain a voter ID card. Mr. Chairman, at this point, if I could have Ms. Stengel walk us through the bill, and then if I may, when she is done, I would offer the A4 amendment, and then I think the bill is in a position where members would be able to ask any questions that they wish.
Thank you, Senator Newman. Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. We'll start on page 3 with section 5, looking at the transportation jurisdiction areas. So section 5 prohibits there from being a fee on an application for a voter identification card. Section 6 is similar in that it prohibits both the commissioner and the driver's license agent from collecting a fee or surcharge when issuing a voter ID card. Section 7 on page 5 is the application for a voter ID card, and it's includes many of the same things as a driver's license or ID card application, but it also includes some additional pieces related to voter eligibility, including proof of citizenship and the length of time at their current residence. Section 8 has to do with the driver's license agent filing fee. This is the $8 that the DLAs charge and get to keep. This prohibits the DLAs from charging the $8 for a voter ID card. And then on page 7, line 10, you'll see that the commissioner then must reimburse the DLA for that filing fee. So for each free card, the DLA will get an $8 reimbursement. Section 9 is the voter ID card itself, and it, again, will look a lot like a driver's license with a photo, a physical description, name, address, those sorts of things. But it must be a different color and have sort of so you can visually see that it's different, and it will be marked to indicate that it is only valid for election purposes. Section 10 mirrors expiration of a voter ID card. You'll see the new language there starting on 8/25. This has to do with people in active military service or their spouse. Essentially, it extends the expiration date based on their deployment. Section 11 has to do with duplicate voter ID cards. So if a person moves or changes names, they must apply for a new card with the new information. Section 12 requires the commissioner to cancel a voter ID card if the person was fraudulent or should not have been issued the card. The next section I'll talk about is section 14 on page 13. And this establishes a voter ID card account, and the money in that account is appropriated to the Commissioner of Public Safety for several things, including reimbursing individuals for documents that they had to obtain, and providing the payments to the DLAs that I mentioned earlier, and then for the cost of the cards themselves. So the bill in other sections provides free underlying documents such as vital records and court records that are obtained in Minnesota. But if a person has to obtain a record and pay for it from another source, they can be reimbursed under paragraph B. And then you'll see that the amount available to the commissioner can't exceed the actual cost of providing the card, and there's a blank there that can be filled in when the fiscal note is completed. And then finally, the Commissioner of Public Safety must report to the transportation committees in the House and Senate about total expenditures from that account. And then finally, if I can find my page, there are a couple of sections towards the end of the bill. Section 38 on page 35 requires the Commissioner of Public Safety to provide training for driver's license agents on the process for issuing the voter ID cards. And section 39 on page 36 is the appropriations. Paragraph B and C appropriate money to the Commissioner of Public Safety. Paragraph B gives money to the Commissioner of Public Safety for programming and those sorts of things. And then Article 2 has several sections in it as well. Article 2 is largely conforming changes where the phrase "or voter identification card" is inserted in several locations where it appears with driver's license and ID cards. I'm not going to go over those right now, but if anybody has questions, I'm happy to walk through those in more detail as well.
Thank you, Ms. Stengel. Any questions? Senator Newman, to your A4 amendment.
Yeah, if I may, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I will move the A4 amendment at this time and ask Ms. Boyd if she would please explain it for you.
Ms. Boyd.
Mr. Chair and Senators, this amendment has to do with sections that Ms. Stengel did not walk through. So for a little background, excuse me, Section 3 on page 2 of the bill has to do with documents required for voter identification card that can be obtained from the Commissioner of Health offices. And it states that no fee can be charged, no fee or surcharge can be no fee or surcharge can be charged for these documents if the person attests that they are needed to obtain a voter identification card. And then in the next section, in Section 4, a number of appropriations and transfers are made to reimburse the commissioners and local offices for the cost of providing these documents. What the A4 amendment does is change language on line 3.6 of the bill. This is sort of analogous to what happens with driver's license agents and deputy registrars that, mostly deputy registrars, but if the fee is, filing fee charged is If a transaction is conducted at, say, a deputy registrar office, that fee is retained by the deputy registrar. If it's done at a DVS office, it's deposited into a state fund. That's the same for this. Some of these documents can be obtained at local issuance offices, and so the fees need to be dealt with in different ways. Some need to be reimbursed to the local issuance offices, and some need to be deposited into the state government special revenue fund. So that is what the A4 amendment does. It splits that one line on 3.6 into dealing with the fee in two different ways.
Thank you. Any questions specific to the A4 first, and then we'll go to the bill? On the A4? Seeing none. Then we'll take a vote on the A4. All those in favor of the A4, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Questions on the bill? Senator Anderson.
This may be for council. Ms. Stengel, I have a daughter that has a Minnesota identification card right now, but if she were to put in, I see there's a letter here from ARC, because she's disabled, they're saying that it'll have a major impact on her. But I think the major impact will be if she wants to fly, she's going to have to get a real ID Minnesota identification card. Am I correct in stating that?
Ms. Stengel.
Mr. Chair and Senator Anderson, I think I understand the question. Any type of state-issued ID card, whether it's a real ID card or not, would be able to be used for voting under the bill. You're correct that, if there are issues of flying, somebody would need a real ID or a passport.
Okay, the fact is that, to me, from what I have been through with my daughter and others in her group home, they've all got Minnesota identification cards, but because they all are able to get on an airplane and fly, they'll need a real ID identification card to be able to access an aircraft to go overseas. To me, if that can be used similar for voter ID, then I don't see any real problems with what's happening here.
Senator Friends.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Senator Newman. As you know, I'm a fan of election law, but I have to offer a few comments. This bill makes it more difficult for Minnesotans to vote. The easier we make it for Minnesotans to vote, the better. The more Minnesotans that vote, the better it is for our state and for our democracy. As we have the highest voter turnout in the nation, I just encourage us to keep track of the things that we do that make things more difficult for Minnesotans. And I do not think we should be requiring voter ID for Minnesotans to vote. I think we should keep the system the way it is now. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Friends. Further questions? Senator Little.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a number of questions. Would you like me to come back to you for each question?
No, you can go to the author, Senator Newman.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Newman and Chair Newman. I just want to first begin with, is voter fraud a problem? And what evidence do we have of that?
Senator Newman.
The United States Supreme Court in the Crawford case took judicial notice of the fact that voter fraud is an historical fact. They indicated that it is sometimes difficult to see or to obtain, and they went on to indicate that in close elections, voter fraud may have or affect the outcome of close elections. And as we know, we have had in the last few years a number of very close elections. Some of the senators that we currently sit with were involved in close elections. The House has had, I remember one election a number of years ago where the separation of the votes at the end of the election or voting was one vote. I believe the percentage of difference in the Coleman versus Franken election was 0.01% of the votes. So the answer that I would give you, Senator Little, is you are correct in assuming that there is very little voter fraud in Minnesota. I think that the Supreme Court acknowledged that. And nevertheless, voter fraud is, according to the Supreme Court, a legitimate reason for a state to be concerned and a legitimate reason why, one of the reasons why they have authorized photo ID laws by the state of Minnesota, or by a state, I should say.
Senator Little.
Thank you for that answer, Senator Newman. And so just to clarify, and you believe that showing an ID and getting a background check will be effective in determining who is or who is not eligible to exercise a fundamental constitutional right?
Senator Newman.
I believe, Senator Little, that the utilization of a photo ID is one of the tools that we can utilize in the 21st century to determine whether or not the person who has shown up at the polling place to vote is in fact the person that they say they are. And again, going back to the Crawford case, they specifically made mention of that fact, that the state has a legitimate interest, and one of the ways in doing that is to have a photo ID requirement. Everybody, and I say this in all sincerity, folks from either side of the aisle have great interest and passion in protecting the integrity of our election system. And don't forget that one of the interests that Crawford found that states have an interest in protecting is that of voter confidence. And they specifically found that if, you know, even if not true, the perception of voter fraud affects voter confidence. And the Crawford case cited a number of statistics to that effect. And that is why, or there is one of the reasons why they decided that photo IDs were okay for states to adopt. The issue of voter fraud is only one of the reasons why photo IDs are allowed. Voter confidence is one. Modernizing our election system is another, and that is one of the tools that we can utilize. And that is modern digital photography that wasn't necessarily available in the 20th or 19th century.
Senator Little.
I'll move to a different part of the process, which is, let's say you get the voter ID, you go to the polling place. I assume it's the election judge that determines whether you are the person on that ID or not. Is that correct?
Senator Newman.
That's correct.
Senator Little.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator Newman, for that answer. I hope, Senator Newman, you're somewhat familiar with the cross-race effect. And that's an effect that's been studied over and over again in multiple different professions where it's easier to recognize someone whose face looks most similar to you. And it's harder to recognize people's faces that are dissimilar to you. So when we have people making that determination as to whether they are the person on the ID or not, don't you see that there could be some pretty detrimental effects to some voters?
Senator Newman.
The only way I would respond to that is that the photo ID is simply one of the tools that election judges would use. In addition to that would be proof of residency. In addition to that is prior registration and a comparison of that information to the voter registration system in the state of Minnesota. So it isn't simply a matter of an election judge looking at a photograph and determining that that person is eligible to vote. It is one of the tools that they would use in order to make that determination.
Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Newman, are you familiar with the 2016 voter fraud case of Noah Summers of Mankato, Minnesota?
Senator Newman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Osmek, no, I am not.
Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll just sort of read through this. This is an ineligible voter. They were charged with a felony, and through a plea agreement, they went down to a misdemeanor and had to pay a $600 fine. Senator Newman, another question. Are you familiar with the 2018 case of Larry Ranker?
Senator Newman.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Osmic, no, I am not.
Senator Osmic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Larry Ranker, he's a resident of Worthington and voted twice in 2018. He received 2 years supervised probation and a $500 fine because he voted twice in a special election. Senator Newman, one last question. Are you familiar with the Darrell Leonard Webb case of 2016?
Senator Newman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Osmic, I'm starting to get embarrassed. The answer again is no, I am not personally familiar with that case.
Senator Osmic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Darrell Leonard Webb, he's from St. Cloud, and he was an ineligible voter, and he was charged with knowingly voting when he was ineligible. He was sentenced to 13 months in prison and ordered to pay a $215 fine. All of these cases, Senator Newman, I can give you the references to the voter fraud that does happen in the state of Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Osmic, for citing 3 instances where there perhaps were some anomalies in voting. But Senator Newman, do you know how many people voted in our last presidential election?
Senator Newman.
Nationally or in the state?
No, in Minnesota.
In the state of Minnesota, I would estimate 3 million.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I
Senator Dibble.
think it was about 3.5 million. Senator Newman, are you familiar with how many people would be denied the ability to vote who would not have the ability to vote under the voter ID laws that you're proposing?
Senator Newman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Dibble, under this bill, I do not believe anyone would be denied the right to vote.
Senator Dibble.
I say that because
Go ahead, Senator Newman.
if a voter is unable to produce the documents necessary to obtain a voter ID, that voter is allowed to execute an affidavit stating the fact that they have tried and were unable to obtain the underlying documents necessary to obtain a voter ID, and they then will have their ballot counted. I also believe that the total number of folks in the state of Minnesota who have neither a driver's license nor a Minnesota ID, nor have the ability to get a voter ID card under this bill is a very small number of people.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble.
So I won't do this prosecutorial style of questioning. Senator Little is good at it. I'm not. I won't do this foundation laying. Senator, I'll leave it to Senator Latz too. He likes to do that. I'll just state that the information that I have tells us that up to 50,000 Minnesotans would be denied the ability to vote. And if you're talking about, even with your voter ID workaround, and that under the provisional voting system, fully 30% of those ballots cast would go uncounted. Furthermore, other states, Indiana, that have tried this voter ID scheme, spend upwards of $10 or more million on those programs. And so my question is, do we have any early indication of what the fiscal note is going to show us? And is that source going to come from the general fund, or where is that going to come from to reimburse individual or the agencies and other entities that need to cover the cost of these free voter IDs?
Senator Newman.
The second part of your question is the funds would come from the general fund. And the purpose of the funding would be to essentially hold people harmless from the costs incurred. That would include the driver's license agents. It would include holding harmless the folks who actually have to obtain the voter ID card. and if they need to pay for the underlying documents necessary to get the voter ID card, all of those costs would be provided to people at no cost, and that comes out of the general fund. The answer to your second, or your first part of your question, what is the fiscal impact? And I don't know that at this point. I suspect that we will not agree as to what our respective estimates are. I think it is going to be relatively a small number of people and therefore a relatively small amount of money coming out of the general fund. And I recognize that you believe it's going to be much larger on the basis of the statistics that you're looking at from other states. However, having said that, I can tell you that photo ID is required in 19 states currently. But we don't know exactly, as we speak right now, what is necessarily in those photo ID statutes. The Crawford case specifically allowed, or I should say one of the reasons the Crawford case specifically allowed photo ID is because of the availability of this affidavit. And I do not believe all states have accepted or adopted that provision of the Crawford case. And to that end, I will tell you that the bill itself, not me, but the bill itself is being criticized by the left, and it is now drawing criticism from the right because of this notion of providing for the affidavit. So in some respects, I think, well, maybe I'm sitting right in the middle with this bill, and the majority of the folks are going to support it.
Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In reference to Senator Dibble, I only displayed 3 cases. I could go on for probably a couple of hours with all the cases that I have available to talk through. So just because I only chose to regale you with tales of 3 of them doesn't mean there aren't a lot more. And I do have information also that says that at least in the last couple of statewide elections, per election, it was over 1,600 voters were ineligible and illegal. And particularly going back to 2008, there were 941 illegal felons allowed to vote in the 2008 election. Just to refresh your memory, Senator Franken defeated Senator Coleman by 312 votes. So the answer is, well, the question put by Senator Newman as far as does this matter? Absolutely it does matter, particularly in close elections. With that, Mr. Chair, I will move for a roll call and request that the roll call be printed in the Journal of the Senate.
Need to see 3 hands to print in the Journal. I'm seeing 3 hands, so the roll call will be taken and the results will be printed in the Journal. Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Senator Osmek. I'm familiar with those numbers, and I'm also familiar with actual credible, supported research, peer-reviewed, that says that those numbers aren't valid at all, that they're generated by those who have an interest in generating those kinds of numbers. So I reject those claims. And when we're talking about 50,000 people possibly being disenfranchised from their core bedrock citizenship right to vote, my perspective on those close elections is quite the opposite, that in fact the outcome would be grossly distorted in ways that we could never anticipate, and we wouldn't be sure of a valid outcome in those close elections. And I think we're actually doing damage to elections and individual citizens' bedrock democratic right as citizens of this country and their ability to vote for the people who represent them. I think it's unconscionable that we're pursuing these efforts to suppress and prohibit and bar people from their exercising their American franchise. So, Mr. Chair, I would offer the A5 amendment and request a roll call vote. And in requesting the roll call vote, I also request that this outcome be recorded in the Journal.
I would like to see 3 hands for that. We have seen 3 hands, so roll call will be taken and the results will be printed in the Journal. The A5 amendment is being distributed. Wait 1 minute, have Senator Newman to the A5. Senator Newman.
Chairman, it's Senator Dibble's amendment. Maybe he wishes to explain it.
Senator Dibble, you want to comment on the A5 amendment?
Mr. Chair, the A5 is a delete everything amendment. That is the language of a bill that I've introduced. I don't remember the bill number. But it would put to the citizens of the state of Minnesota the opportunity to vote on an amendment to our state's constitutions, which simply reads that elections shall be free, fair, and equal. No civil or military power shall at any time interfere with the free exercise of the right to vote. I think actually it should be supported by everyone on this committee, no matter their perspective, because the arguments that are offered in favor of the bill that's in front of us are that elections aren't free, fair, and equal. So I guess that's in the eye of the beholder. I think quite the opposite. So, you know, if you firmly believe that at this time elections are not being conducted in a free, fair, and equal way, you should support this. This basically speaks to the bedrock principle of everyone's right to vote. We're one of about 20 states that don't have this kind of basic protection around our elections and voting system in their constitutions. We know that the Supreme Court has ruled in such a way that basically really puts the burden and the onus and the responsibility for guaranteeing the right to vote and conducting elections in a free, fair, open, and transparent way back to the states, that it's not a federal matter, it's not contained within the U.S. Constitution, and federal laws around voting and voting rights were largely voided by that recent decision. You know, laws that turn on voter ID laws and districting and election finance, et cetera, really are a matter of the states to regulate. So a number of states, most of the states, just over half, have these provisions in their constitution. The only language in our constitution just speaks to some of the particularities around who can vote and et cetera. But in terms of a guaranteed right and making sure that our elections are unfettered, that lacks, and it's a glaring omission in our state's constitution.
Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Dibble, thank you. I would oppose the amendment for the following reasons. First of all, Senator Dibble would be absolutely at liberty to bring a bill for a constitutional amendment if he wishes. This particular amendment has nothing whatsoever to do with Senate File 3571 and is not asking for a constitutional amendment. It is asking for statutory authority. So if we are to entertain a constitutional amendment, let's have a bill brought forward and have a discussion at length on that notion. I would also oppose the constitutional amendment because I rather suspect that either the Minnesota State Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court is going to demand that elections be free and fair and equal. And I'm not at all convinced that such a constitutional amendment is needed or is necessary. Finally, this could be interpreted to mean folks other than citizens could vote, because there is no mention in here whatsoever as to who can vote. It's just that they are to be free, fair, and equal.
Senator Dibble.
I respect Senator Newman's rationale, although I disagree with his final point. The Minnesota Constitution already has language that specifies who can vote: citizens that are 18 years or older and have not had their civil rights restored after a felony conviction. So any language like that in this would be redundant. This simply adds to the existing language of the Constitution.
Further comments on the A5? Senator Little.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a comment on the A5 and also a comment on the bill. I think I'll just do them all at once, if that's okay with you.
I'd like to keep on the A5 amendment, and then we'll put you back on the list for the remainder of the bill.
All right.
To the A5.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just want to make a point on the last argument that Senator Newman said that this could be for anybody to vote. I disagree with the reading of that. There is the language right to vote a couple of times in the bill. So you'd have to have the right to vote, which would mean if you're not a citizen, you couldn't vote. So I will make my comment on the bill.
Senator Howe to the A5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to Senator Dibble's comments on the Constitution requiring a citizenship, but there's nowhere, anywhere in our Constitution or our statute that requires verification of citizenship. The only thing it does is when you register, it requires a oath or a pledge, or it basically says you're confirming that you're a citizen, which I can verify to you with a phone number. You can talk to someone that is struggling with that at this time because they didn't understand that they couldn't vote and is in the process of getting deported after being in this country for 35 years. So something in here that says that you're required to provide proof of citizenship would probably eliminate that problem that she is facing at this time. But I would, I'm tempted to offer a couple of oral amendments to this, and the oral amendment would read something to the effect of elections shall be free, fair, and equal with voter ID, and then say no civil or military power shall at any time interfere with the free exercise of a citizen's right to vote.
Senator Howe, so are you offering that verbal?
I'll offer that amendment.
Say that again.
I will offer that amendment. You want me to say it again?
Senator Howe offers the verbal amendment. You can repeat it one more time for Ms. Stengel, and then she'll repeat the amendment.
After equal before the period with voter ID or voter identification, and then after, on line 1.7, after the citizens, and before right, add citizens' right to vote. Yeah, we probably need to do the same and on line 11 and line 112.
I'm going to give Ms. Stengel 1 minute to process this. Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Senator Howe, I would propose a slightly different approach to the photo ID and insert a separate sentence in there. I'll read it off. If that doesn't work for you, let me know. On page 1, line 6, after the period, insert a photo identification is required in order to vote, period. Page 1, line 7, delete the and insert a citizens, and delete 2 and insert for the citizen. So this section would now read, election shall be free, fair, and equal. A photo identification is required in order to vote. No civil or military power shall at any time interfere with the free exercise of a citizen's right for the citizen to vote. And then on page 1, line 12, a similar change, delete the, insert a citizens, and delete 2 and insert for the citizen.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, of course, I would agree with the citizens language and would happily accept that as a friendly amendment. The voter ID piece, of course, creates the internal inconsistency to the language of the constitutional amendment. Clearly a damaging amendment designed in a way that would completely subordinate and subterfuge the purpose of the proposal. So the voter ID piece, I would reject and encourage a no vote. I'm wondering, I have two questions. One is if Senator Howe would be willing to offer the citizens piece separately. I guess if that's the case.
Senator Howe.
Easy answer, no.
All right. And Mr. Chair,
Senator Dibble.
is it, I don't know if it's possible to divide the amendment, or if this is not the kind of amendment that can be divided, maybe Ms. Stengel can help us and we can vote separately on voter ID and separately on citizen.
Ms. Stengel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I would defer to the chair on whether the subject area is something that can be divided into two sections, but technically speaking, I think this is something that could be divided into two pieces, one about the citizenship and one about photo ID.
I knew you'd do something like this. No, I'm just kidding. 1 second, 1 minute. I'm going to rule that the amendment cannot be divided. To the oral amendment, Senator Little.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just remind the committee that the people of Minnesota have already seen this oral amendment, and they said no to the oral amendment, so I'll be standing with the people of Minnesota.
Further comments on the A5 as amended? Senator Senjum.
Mr. Chair, I think we have to realize what we're doing here today, and that is on the fly, I will just say, messing with the Constitution of the state of Minnesota. This is serious business. I know it's meant seriously at this table, but I would reject this amendment, and I would reject the underlying amendment. I just don't think you deal with changes to the Constitution of the state of Minnesota without approaching it from the standpoint of a bill which goes through a process. You just don't, if you will, mess with the state of Minnesota's Constitution on the fly with these kind of amendments.
Senator Newman.
Mr. Chairman, while as Ms. Stengel outlined an oral amendment, if that was in fact embedded in our Constitution, I don't think that I would have any strong reservations. However, I do think that Senator Senjum is correct, that monkeying around with our Constitution on the fly is something that we ought not to be doing. And that is why I recommended that if Senator Dibble, in fact, wants to propose a constitutional amendment, I think a bill should be drafted, and the committee should entertain that bill. Senator Dibble has every right in the world to bring this amendment forward and offer it. But while on the one hand I do like Senator Howe's oral amendment, I think the time and the place to offer it is in a discussion on whether or not we're going to amend our Constitution. And it just isn't germane, as far as I am concerned, to Senate File 3571. This is really important, a proposed constitutional amendment, really important. I think we should take it very seriously, and it should not be entertained in the context of Senate File 3571.
Thanks, Chairman. Senator Klein.
I yield my.
Senator Dibble, I'm interested if you're interested in withdrawing the A5 or if you want the vote.
Mr. Chair, absolutely not. I think 3571 is a shock to the conscience. I am absolutely serious. I think this is a very grave matter. 3571 is a very serious, the implications of 3571 are very, very serious for our elections and our democracy. And I think it's important that we be given the opportunity to vote on something that says something quite the opposite, that we view a citizen's right to vote as absolutely bedrock and in no way are interested in diminishing anyone's ability to access elections or to take a vote in the context of an election that isn't perfectly fair. And so I would continue to offer the A5.
Okay, any other discussion on the verbal amendment to the A5? Seeing none, the roll call has been requested. Roll call granted. The clerk will take the roll.
Chair Newman.
No.
Senator Anderson. No. Senator Carlson. Senator Dibble. No. Senator Franzen. Senator Frentz.
No.
Senator Hall. No. Senator Howe. Aye. Senator Jasinski.
No.
Senator Kent. Senator Klein. No. Senator Lang. No. Senator Little. No. Senator Osmek.
Yes.
Senator Rarick. No. Senator Senjum. No. Senator Carlson. Senator Franzen. Senator Kent.
The results to the oral amendment with 2 votes for yes and 11 votes no, the oral amendment does not pass. Further discussion. Senator Senjum. Correct. We are on the underlying A5 amendment. Any further discussion on the A5? I believe roll call was requested on the A5 as well. The clerk will take the roll on the A5 amendment.
Chair Newman.
No.
Senator Anderson.
No.
Senator Carlson. Senator Dibble.
Yes.
Senator Franzen. Senator Frentz.
Yes.
Senator Hall.
No.
Senator Howe.
No.
Senator Jasinski.
No.
Senator Kent. Senator Klein.
Yes.
Senator Lang. Senator Little.
Yes.
Senator Osmek.
Yes.
Senator Rarick.
No.
Senator Senjum. Senator Carlson. Senator Franzen. Senator Kent.
Results of the A5 amendment, with there being 5 yeses and 8 noes, the amendment does not pass. Further discussion on the bill. Senator Senjum.
Senator Newman, if you would have the bill, do you have the bill? Can you go to page 11, line 30 through 32, and there's language in there. It's somewhat similar to the last bill that you might want to look at as this travels along. You know, the exclusive use of the word bank, and that just maybe needs a little bit further looking at in terms of how we define a financial institution. That's all.
Any other discussion?
Thank you, Senator Senjum.
With our time limits as they are, I think if there's no other discussion, Senator Newman, you want any closing comments?
Well, the closing comments I would have is that I know that this is a topic that is very controversial for some folks, feel very strongly about it. I respect your position on it. I'm not sure I understand, but I do respect your position. And I hope that as we move forward with this bill, we simply keep in mind the precepts as outlined in Crawford. I think we should keep in mind the fact that other states have adopted photo ID requirements. And I can tell you that the research that I have been provided with, in fact, shows no perceptible difference or disenfranchisement of voters as a result of photo ID being adopted. And I think that that is one of the benefits of being here in 2020, looking back at Crawford, which was decided in 2008, because there's lots and lots of states that have looked at this. There are lots of studies that have been made. And the fear of folks being disenfranchised as a result of having this 21st century tool available to voting elections or voting officials it just does not appear to be present at all. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would move Senate File 3571 as amended be recommended to pass and be re-referred to the Committee on Judiciary.
Senator Newman makes the motion to approve Senate File 3571. Roll call has been requested. Roll call granted. The clerk will take the roll.
Chair Newman.
Yes.
Senator Anderson.
Yes.
Senator Carlson. Senator Dibble.
No.
Senator Franzen. Senator Frentz.
No.
Senator Hall.
Yes.
Senator Howe. Senator Jasinski.
Yes.
Senator Kent. Senator Klein. Senator Lang.
Yes.
Senator Little.
No.
Senator Osmek.
Yes.
Senator Rarick.
Yes.
Senator Senjum.
Yes.
Senator Carlson. Senator Franzen. Senator Kent.
Senate File 3571, based on the vote, is approved with the vote being 9 yes and 4 no. Bill passed. There being no other business today, we are adjourned.